On March 18, 2026, City Skylines celebrated its anniversary with the release of a brand new content pack, City Stations. And at first glance, this might be one of the most promising additions to City Skylines 2 so far. The idea behind this pack is definitely strong. Compact depots, new station types, overpasses, as well as bus and tram shelters. Tools that aim to make public transport not only more efficient, but also far more realistic and visually appealing. But the more time you spend with it, the more cracks start to show. Because while some of these features are really useful, others feel oversized, overpriced, or simply unfinished. So in this video, I am going to show you the 5 biggest advantages and the 5 most important problems of city stations, all based on real gameplay experience. Let's dive in. The first major advantage of the city stations expansion is that you can build significantly smaller garages, depots, and bus stations than before. This means these compact facilities fit much more easily into your city and are far easier to place. The idea of compact infrastructure was already introduced earlier in the base game for trains and metro through a free update, but now it has been extended to all transport types. So we now have new depots and garages for buses, trams, metro, and rail, which makes integrating transport networks into the city much more flexible. Of course, these compact buildings don't offer the same capacity as their larger counterparts, but in return they are much more versatile. This is especially true for bus transport, where not only the depots but also the stations have become smaller and more practical, making them much easier to integrate into the existing urban fabric. As a result, designing your entire transport system becomes significantly more flexible. The new tram station in particular takes city planning to a completely new level. You can simply think much more ahead. It is true that these buildings only become available around level 6 to 8, but from that point on they significantly change the gameplay. If you place a tram station in a well-chosen central location, you can organize all your tram lines around it. They don't just pass through, it can actually function as a proper terminal. The same applies to larger stations as well. With these, you are no longer building simple stops, but real intermodal hubs where tram, metro, and railway meet in one place. There is one very important limitation, however. Because these stations take up a huge amount of space, you can't just fit them in later. You have to plan ahead. You need to decide their location early and build your city in a way that allows all your lines to connect to them later. And on top of that, these stations are not only functionally strong, but they also add a lot visually to your city, especially railway and metro infrastructure. They become defining elements of the cityscape. The city stations expansion introduces overpasses as well as bus and tram shelters, and these open up entirely new possibilities in city building. You have 4 predefined sizes of overpasses available, which you can use from smaller streets all the way up to the widest main road. And this is important because these are not just decorative elements, they are actual traffic management tools. If you build overpasses, you can eliminate pedestrians crossing on a given road section, meaning that you can replace up to 7 or 8 pedestrian crosswalks with just 2 or 3 overpasses. The result in much smoother and more continuous car traffic. And then there are the shelters. These appear at bus and tram stops, and although there is only one type of each, their impact is significant. While a basic bus stop provides around 10 comfort and even more advanced versions reach roughly 50, these new shelters offer a comfort level of 60. And this is not just a number. It means that passengers looking for more comfortable travel and much more likely to choose public transport. And this is where the real benefit of the system comes in. This expansion efficiently introduces double traffic calming. On the one hand, locally overpasses reduce congestion. On the other hand, globally, shelters shift more people toward public transport, fewer crossings, fewer cars, and more continuous flow throughout the city. That's why I see city stations not just a visual upgrade, but as a definitely useful tool for efficient city planning. It is no coincidence that the slogan of the city stations expansion is transit meets design. The stations and buildings you get with this pack, from depots to large central hubs, are all visually impressive and highly detailed, making them strong elements of your city's identity. Some standouts include the massive, almost monumental main railway station, as well as the sunken subway park, which can function as a central metro hub. With these, forward planning becomes especially important because their size makes it almost impossible to integrate them later into an already developed city. That's why it is worth assigning their location early and shaping your future networks around them. What is particularly exciting is that you can, for example, cover the large railway station and create a park on top of it, combining transport and recreational functions in a single place. In addition, overpasses and several station types also contribute to outdoor recreation value, meaning they don't just serve a functional role, but also act as decorative and city-enhancing element. And finally, the fifth advantage of the city stations expansion is what I could call a move toward underground rail solution. It is clearly visible that to some extent, even if still limited, the game now allows you to guide railway lines underground. For example, in the case of the main railway station, there is an upgrade that allows the tracks to be partially placed underground. I will talk about the limitations of this later, but the important point is that this option finally exists. This matters because it brings the game closer to real-world urban design, especially in large Western European cities, where terminal stations are often converted into bypass main stations. The sunken railway station is also a very interesting addition. It acts as a semi-sunken station that does not require long ramps, making it much easier to move rail infrastructure below ground. All of this means that whether through the main city station upgrades, or the sunken railway station, railway systems can be integrated much more naturally into the fabric of the city. It becomes easier to hide them from the surface, which is not only visually beneficial, but also gives you much more freedom in city planning. Now let's look at the 5 main drawbacks of city stations expansion, because there are definitely some. The first issue is the size of the stations. It is true that the garages and bus stations are nicely compact, but metro stations and especially train stations are in a completely different category. Not only the main train station enormous, but the elevated and sunken railway stations also require a huge amount of space, which makes them much harder to integrate into the city. Personally, I think it would have been better if the pack had included fewer buildings overall, but made room for smaller and more practical elevated and sunken train stations as well. simply because those would be much more flexible to use and much easier to fit into an existing city layout. Certainly, it is still a clear improvement that these new station types were added to the game at all. That is definitely a good thing. But I am convinced that if there had also been smaller, less spectacular versions of them, players would end up using those much more often. And that matters because the true value of an expansion is not just how impressive it looks, but also how often you can actually use it in practice. For example, if we had received stations similar in size to the small train station, just in elevated and sunken versions, those would have been practical in a huge number of situations. As it stands, however, you need to be prepared for the fact that these bypass-style stations are even larger than similar buildings in City Skylines 1, which means you simply won't be able to use them everywhere, especially not if you want to integrate rail infrastructure into an already existing city. The next major issue with city stations is that it makes cities much harder to reshape later on. If you are building a new city from scratch and you already leave space from tram terminals and large transport hubs, then the system can work very well. But if you already have an existing city, placing these buildings often requires serious demolition. The reason is simple. Some of these stations are just too large, so fitting them into an already developed urban fabric becomes extremely difficult. That is why, since many of these buildings only become available around level 6, 8 or even 10, it is worth planning for them much earlier and reserving space for them in advance. The situation becomes even more complicated because unlocking some of these stations is not always logical either. For example, you can only unlock the elevated subway bypass station variant if you have already built a basic elevated subway station beforehand, which is not exactly the most intuitive system. So if you want to integrate these elements into an already developed city, you should be prepared for a very difficult task. This is especially true for the main city station. I had one city where I tried to replace the existing station with the new one, and it turned out to be practically impossible because the new main station is almost the size of a small airport. Its footprint is so large that I would have had to demolish almost an entire district just to make room for it. So overall, this is something you definitely need to keep in mind. These buildings are not only big, but they also shape the long-term structure of your city and make later redesigns much more difficult. The next problem is that although these new transport buildings and structures are now in the game, several of them feel more like half-finished solutions than fully developed systems. There are some fairly basic urban planning considerations that simply were not taken into account. I would highlight two examples. The first is the way tram shelters work. For example, you can only place the new designer-style tram stop if the tram is running on a road surface. If the tracks run separately on their own alignment, the game simply won't let you place that stop type. Now, technically, there is a workaround. If you build a pedestrian street on that section and connect it with footpaths, car will not appear, but the game still treats the surface as a road, which then allows you to place the stop. But obviously that is a workaround, not a properly throughout system. The second and more serious issue is the way overpasses function. These can only be built within a fairly rigid system. You choose from 4 predefined sizes and then basically just place them on top of a road. That works well enough if you are building over a normal street. But if you want to build an overpass above a motorway, railway or metro line, then problems start to appear. The reason is that overpasses have lighting, and because of that they require electricity. If they are placed above a normal road that is handled automatically, since the road provides power. But if you want to place them above other types of infrastructure, you are forced to add a small road segment nearby just to provide electricity. Visually, that is quite awkward, and it also makes pedestrian connections more difficult because the overpasses no longer connect naturally into the surrounding network. On top of that, these overpasses cannot be properly integrated into the road system, and cyclists cannot use them either. So in practice, they are limited almost entirely to pedestrian traffic. Overall, these features look good, but in terms of functionality, they leave a clear sense of incompleteness, and the whole system could definitely use a later revision or expansion. The next problem shows up mainly in the earlier stages of the game, roughly below level 6 or 7, when your income is still unstable and every expense matters, especially on normal difficulty. The issue here is that many of the props and transport structures are surprisingly expensive. A designer tram stop, for example, costs around 5,000, which is still manageable on its own. But once you move up to the larger stations, you are already dealing with costs in the hundreds of thousands, and in the case of the main city station, even into the millions. That seriously limits how much you can actually use these elements during the early phases of building a city. And overpasses are not cheap either. Even the smallest one costs around 10,000, while the larger ones can go up to 35,000. What is really surprising, though, is that even the decorative props attached to different stations cost money. That feels strange because the logic of City Skylines and City Skylines 2 has usually been that props are free since they serve a purely aesthetic purpose and do not directly affect gameplay or citizen satisfaction. Here, however, the game can charge 5 or even 6-figure sums for a single decorative element that essentially just adds visual value. Because of this, the use of props becomes especially limited in the early game, and that goes somewhat against the earlier design philosophy of letting players beautify their cities freely without extra cost. And finally, let's look at what is probably the most frustrating issue, and also the biggest missed opportunity. While the game makes a small step toward underground rail, the system still feels incomplete. What's the missing are true underground railway stations and the ability to integrate rail more naturally below ground. The sunken railway station is a decent first attempt, but it feels more like a transition between surface and underground rather than a real solution. If it were smaller and could be placed deeper, it would be far more useful. Even more importantly, there are no proper underground train stations at all, and that alone could have been a breakthrough feature. It would allow rail to become a natural part of the city instead of a difficult surface system. And this isn't unrealistic. In many real cities, rail goes underground, especially near central stations. Think of Stuttgart, Melbourne, or New York. The same applies to trams, which often run in underground sections, functioning like pre-metro systems. That's why this is something the developers should seriously reconsider, especially as City Skylines 2 is starting to face stronger competition. That is Transport Fever 3, which is evolving from a transport game into something much closer to a city builder. Opening up these possibilities would not only improve gameplay, but also push the game toward a more flexible and modern approach to city building and transport design. Overall, I think City Stations is a useful and visually impressive expansion, but it clearly needed more polishing in several areas. Its biggest benefit is that it opens up new directions in city planning, especially with public transport hubs and more aesthetic station design. At the same time, the oversized buildings and some unfinished systems show that this pack could have delivered more. That's why I see city stations more as a strong foundation than a real breakthrough. That said, it is important to mention that the pack is very well received on Steam with a 94% positive rating, so players clearly see the value in it. My slightly lower score comes from a different perspective. I am looking at long-term gameplay depth and system design, not just immediate usefulness. For now, I would give it a solid 7 out of 10. If you enjoyed this analysis, don't forget to subscribe for more City Skylines content every week. And let me know in the comments, what score would you give City Stations DLC? Have a nice day and see you in the next video.